What it is, what it was, what it shall be. We're back again. Today's video, Spiritwar Bootcamp number 113. This is entitled The Transhuman Metanarrative. So what is that? Transhumanism is where the movement of society beyond the normal human norms, right, at a gradual incremental pace. You know, this involves things like neural brain interface, right? I think wearables is getting us really close. Like there's so much more and more integration between our physical biology and these artificial constructs, let's say, you know, simulacra, like layers and layers of simulated realities that we're all encrusted with, right? So as we've been talking about in the previous videos, dealing with the psychodrama, you know, this is largely the way that our life is maintained through a psychodrama, because we're given a meta-narrative. So a narrative would just be the sequence of events of something that happens, like the plot or the script of something, right? But the meta-narrative tells you how to interpret it. It gives you context and interpretation surrounding the narrative itself. You could think of it as spin. A lot of people use the term spin, so that's your own personal twist on the events that you put in there. So this is what we would call the meta-narrative. So now, how does the transhuman meta-narrative? Well, it involves lots of things. I would say largely mass media is one of the very important things to look at, you know, because that influences a lot of people, and it's like a shared experience that a lot of people have, and in a way that's a big component of the meta-narrative. So like the way that American thinks about history versus a Russian, for instance, I'm sure they have a very different thing of how they conceptualize their own past and their own history. And so this gets back into the psychodrama. So I'm going to point out something interesting. So all these famous people have a similar life pattern, right? Thomas Jefferson, let's start with him. His dad dies when he's really young. He inherits all his land and his dealings, right? And he's raised by his mother. Aleister Crowley, father dies when he's very young, taken over by his mother, but you know, it's a similar story. And then if you look at Ian Fleming, you know, same story. He's loses his dad at a young age, right? And he gets put into this, you know, system over there. He's going to all these elite prep schools for the military intelligence and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So, and he's getting put into a meta-narrative, you know? So, and that's what a lot of these initiatory orders are all about. They use a psychodrama to recontextualize the identity of every individual, and usually it's like a graduated process, you know? And everyone's getting somewhat individualized training. You know, they may fall within a general grouping of things, but everyone has this particular training system and training experience that's involved. But the point is, so how do meta-narratives function in our world? Why is that important? Why should we think about that? Because if someone can define our history and our cultural context for us artificially, externally, right? They have the power to change how we think about ourselves, and it changes our sense of possibility in the world and how we define our objectives. And so they're defining all these subtle little parameters that's gradually constraining our mental reality, right? So that influences behavior. So the thesis that I'm doing in a lot of these videos is just the question, like, what if there's a system of human herding and human animal husbandry on humans, right? Like, what if that's thousands of years old? That's the oldest thing there is. It's older than history. It's older than science. It's older than anything else. So a lot of that continuity is due to the control of the meta-narrative. So this is where myths and stories come in, and how myths and stories serve as a defining cultural framework for everyone. And so by controlling the myths and stories, you have a lot of influence on the psyche of large numbers of people. This is the means they try to use. And so this is why all these different things are created: mass media, religions, and so on, ritualistic behavior, mythic narratives, like all that, fake history, ancient alien, like all that same stuff. It's all there, and it's all to instill a particular viewpoint. And I'm contending that this can be defined in terms of the transhuman agenda, going all the way back to the beginning of time. So some of the earliest myths that we have out of Sumer and Babylon describes the artificial creation of the human race in jars, right? So it defines the human cattle as being more or less the way that like a horse breeder would think about racehorses or something like that. It's like that's how they're defined in these stories, and these stories go all the way back to the ancient world. And so how does that impact behavior? So the person behaves in a particular way if they think that they're a created thing at the mercy of some foreign external entity, and especially if there's some kind of unbreachable hierarchy between the human tier and this god tier or demigod tier or whatever you want to call it, right? If there's a barrier there that's really hard to breach, it develops. So let's look at how this is dealt with in the Greek mythos, for example. You have Jupiter. So Jupiter, or Jove, Zeus, right? Like he has all these kids with everything and everyone, different types of animals and like all kinds of, like he just is prolific procreator, right? But usually he never sees or talks to his own kids. Like he might they have a God blessing as a being part of his bloodline or whatever, and it gives them power, but it's like they still have to kind of do everything for themselves to survive basically, right? And they have enormous odds like stacked against them from the beginning, but then they also have certain type of help along the way as well. So it's like you're not born a demigod in a sense. Like you have to grow into it and become it, right? And this is the subject of a lot of different mythologies around the world. But let's look at this concept of the transhuman metanarrative. So just as humans now are being modified through technology, through CRISPR, gene editing, who knows what all they got going on. There's a lot of crazy rumors about the Chinese gene editors and their military super soldiers and stuff like that. It's, who knows what's really going on. But the thing is, with a mythology or a narrative or a meta-narrative or a psychodrama, like you're framing the cattle experience, right? Like you're showing them their world in the way that you want them to see it from, But as I've contended all along, there's multi-tiers of educational system. Like the rulers of our society, like the human herders, right? They have a different type of education. They have a different mythic history. They have a different meta-narrative than we do, right? They just get told, it's in a way they have the same story, but they get told a different interpretation of it, right? But you can still see the message that was put there for them, right? In the text, if you can look at it with clear eyes, like you can see how this is written into all these mythic stories that we have now. And there's a lot of crazy violence and crazy insane behavior in all these myths and stories, like child abuse, fucking violence, every kind of human animal interbreeding, human god interbreeding. Like that's kind of what the story is all about. But just the way that these so-called Anunnaki and these human herders were like sculpting the destiny of humanity and trying to build a perfect slave caste, right? So slave caste, you want them to have enough capacity to do meaningful work, right? But you don't want them to have kind of metacognition. You don't want them to be able to think and question their reality that much. So it's like you're trying to tread this fine little line. Also, if you make them too divergent, they become genetically unstable. So that's a whole other thing you got to take into consideration. But one of the ways of exercising metagenetics, eugenics, and dysgenics is through the psychodrama, believe it or not. So you can artificially impose stressors, you can impose deceptions, you can impose all kinds of external conditions onto each other as human beings, like especially if you know that the game is being played, right? And that's why I'm trying to point out that most people have no concept that this game is even being played, that there's a mental domain of warfare, there's a perceptual domain of warfare, right, through which worlds are controlled and bought and sold, right? So you have to master that to have freedom as a living creature. Like you have to master that. Without the mastery of that, you're going to be in someone else's script forever, for all eternity, right? That's not a desirable outcome, right? And some people talk about the genetic code, right, and stuff like that. So they want to have you think of genetics as a script that's written, but really it's a meta-narrative because it's constantly being changed and altered and diverted in different ways by our decision making and by environmental factors as well. And so it's alive, right? But if you were the herders of humanity, you wouldn't want them to think that or know that. And if you had to leave that in the stories, you would hide it in a certain different way to make sure that only certain people even pick up on the possibility of that, right? So this is why the technocracy, right, and the transhuman agenda is an attempt to alter the biology, the psychology, and the very essence of what humans are through epigenetics, metagenetics, optogenetics, etc., right? They want to create humanity as a livestock, as a human resource, if you will, an expendable or replaceable human workforce, right? So, but you don't have to conceptualize yourself in such a way, believe it or not. Other worlds are possible. So that's why they got to try to get everyone into all these different cults and these different secret societies, sororities, fraternities, whatever you want to call them, labor unions, political parties, sports ball teams, like all these different things. You know, it's a script. It's a psychodrama meta-narrative that's being imposed to give you a particular perspective on reality. But you can create alternate script, and it's high probability that a real true alternate script that's the will of an individual will be more powerful than some kind of AI slop that's out there propagating, because it will lack relatability and true to life qualities to it. So that's why I see the transhuman meta-narrative as a fail, and it will fail, because what they actually want is stasis. They're pretending that they want advancement, but what they really are trying to create is stasis with themselves at the peak power pyramid. You know what I mean? So that's a very weak strategic position for a variety of reasons, because defending that positionality is like a never-ending, it's a never-ending game. And it's not really a game that can really be won. So most people who are of a high intelligence would see to opt out of different things at different levels, right? They would probably see it coming in a certain sense. So part of learning that ability to detect the, meta-narrative wielding operations, the psi war, the spirit war, etc., to skew human consciousness with the narratives and meta-narratives. And so I think that's why it's good to have a wide vocabulary of mythic stories and narratives and cultural legacies of different parts of the world and different historical things, because that's like your bag of tricks. And I would say the evil arcs aren't really that creative. Like, they don't really innovate much tech. Like, they just kind of repeat and rehash. So if you know the playbook, like, it limits their ability to psych you out or to surprise you or shock you, because you've kind of already contemplated. And so how do you do that? Well, you could learn what the secret societies do and just basically invert it. So like how these different groups, they want to have possession and oppression over human souls and be able to control their outcomes. And humans have a known amount of vices which they themselves elaborate, called the 7 deadly sins. They have different levels of 7 tendencies towards vice, and that's why the Sabbateans and 007, they're the wielders of vice, and they wield that to control outcomes. And so there's 1 million Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah Witnesses. Like, I could give you a million different examples of Sabbatean fronts and Sabbatean cults all around the world. And this is what they do. So they're trying to align themselves with what would be considered the archons, or these powers of deception that are created as these, like, spirit wardens for humanity to keep us in check, And unless we learn to surpass their confinement, like, we'll never really experience the whole nature of our true self, right? Because we're composites, right? We're composed of a variety of layers of consciousness and capabilities, right? And we're all an intersection of a great many. But that, because of that, we can be taken over, we can be controlled, we can be manipulated by these non-physical domains of conduct, action, and information flow, right? So that's why we're trying to learn the protocols of psychological warfare operations, and so forth. worldview wars. We got to learn about that in the spirit war. We got to learn about this domain of securing ourselves and maintaining sovereignty and freedom. And then the first thing we have to learn is, how to defend against the 7 deadly vices, right? That can corrupt our mind, that make us weak, that make us subjugatable, right, to others, and make us more likely to become a sabbatical goat, scapegoat, right? So we don't want to become that. So in order to accomplish that, we have to complete mastery in at least these 7 areas, right? To prevent, because humans, emotions distort our perceptions. That's one way of looking at it. But not just emotions, other reactions, instinctive reactions, and these different things. It's like that can be used against us to deflect, distract, disorient, and disinform on every level. So we have to always be conscious that we're existing in this domain, in the information domain, in the infosphere, infowar, psychological operations, right? Information control is reality control, right? And that's why we're living in this. That's why metanarrative, you recognize that metanarrative is the most important thing. It's the control and the adaptability over the narrative, right? Because if you lose that, then you're subject to all types of information warfare, right? If you lose that superiority, if you lose that mimetic incompetence, right? Your brain so what does this say? A simple phrase, okay? If you don't control your mind, someone will. That's the simple thing of it. So how to control it, you have to understand these 7 corruptible gateways of our perceptions and our reality. Some people would correspond this to the 7 archangels, if you want. But it's just a mental concept that we have to maintain defense on all these different layers. To maintain sovereignty and self-will over our own conduct of body, speech, and mind, right? That's the goal. And so the meta-narrative serves to attack all of our weak points and distract us away from our center and our sense of self-preservation and our sense of, compassionate participation with all reality. Like, we need all that to connect, and we need to basically come up with a meta-narrative of our own that's synergistic, that's, instead of being combative and being like a zero-sum game and being like battle mode, battle royale forever, right? So what if we cooperate instead? You know what I mean? And there's a whole ideology behind that, right? There's a whole metaphysics of the cooperative model of reality. But this can't be allowed in our society because we live in a dominance hierarchy. Like, our society is basically like an engine that thrives off of inequality, right? It's artificial scarcity. It creates artificial economic pressure in all these different kinds of ways. And it imprints and implants the whole population with the control agenda, right? So that there doesn't even need to be politicians, that humans are like hackable wearables that just propagate the commands for everyone. They do it for free to each other. But so you don't have to participate in that meta narrative, right? Like, you can maintain narrative supremacy in your own psychological domain. Like, you have narrative control. You're the senior senior writer. Anyway, so this is what we're trying to learn, and a good way to learn that is you learn the motifs and you learn all these tactics and tendencies of these secret societies that go back thousands of years. And you learn how they use symbol and metaphor to encode a script, right, in a way that's imperceptible often to the conscious, rational, reasoning mind, right? They bypass that by hacking into the 7 deadly sins, by hacking into the emotional reactivity, right? By hacking in and giving us a loop program that keeps us expending energy without any progress, right? These are the weapons of the Psywar, right? You're being attacked with thought loops. Vadim Zeland has an interesting term he calls pendulums. I think that's highly related, because if you think like a pendulum, it swings. And so if you react to one swing or the other, it's just going to come back and bap you, right? Because that's what it does. It oscillates like that. And so every time you either chase it or try to avoid it, like, it draws energy off you from that process. So you have to release attachment to the oscillation of the pendulum And that's the same thing with these thought loops. If you get a thought loop installed in you, it's like having a computer virus or a malware or something like that. It's this loop that starts sucking all your processing power. And it's a reiterative, non-productive loop. So it goes over and over despite producing no result. So it's good to learn what those are. Like, of course, in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, he describes it as, and Chitivritam Nirodha, which means the cessation of mental fluctuation, or the cessation of mental oscillation, So these vritti are these transformations, right? These thought form shifts, right? It's always keeping our mind in a loop. And those can be imposed in a variety of ways on a variety of levels. And so by learning the ways of the Green Lodge, right, you learn that they're teaching kind of the same thing from a different angle, right? They're teaching similar concepts. And this goes actually way back to the Chaldeans, right? The Chaldean astronomers, the Babylonians, Assyrians, Akkadians, right? All those types of people had this way, way back. It's very, very ancient, okay? The sevenfold planetary system. And so you can learn a lot by learning about that. But the primarily thing that you're going to learn is that humans are a composite consciousness and a composite awareness. And due to that, our system has a variety of functional vulnerabilities on the thought domain, on the spirit domain, on the emotional and intellectual domain. Like, we have the variety of these types of vulnerabilities where we get stuck in thought loops. Usually it amounts to either inflation or deflation, right? Or it amounts to greed or aversion, greed or hate, greed or anger, right? Something like along those lines. Like, there's certain things that we want to grab and get, and there's certain things that we want to keep away, right? And we spend energy on both of those things. Mental energy, planning energy, worry and anxiety, all kinds of different things that we do when you think about stuff that we want or don't want. But think about this. If you have a fundamental ignorance about your own nature and a nature of external reality, if you have a fundamental ignorance about that, none of the strategies that you produce to get what you want, so-called, none of them will ever be satisfactory, right? Or functional to much degree for that very reason. Because we often desire what's bad for us, and we are always a lot of times averse to things that would actually be good for us, right? So that's called fundamental ignorance of pleasure and pain, cause and effect, right? So we don't know how cause and effect works, or we don't implement it correctly, and so we're always getting an unsatisfactory result on that basis. So my contention is that there can be an external, and there is in almost everyone I've ever met, they have an external bias that's been implanted in them, to coerce a certain type of outcome and a certain type of self-image for those people, and thereby it's like creating a little container for their behavior and their possibilities. So if you learn that that's a fact, right, and you learn how they do that, you learn the ways and tendencies and strategies that they have, you can learn the opposite. So how to protect a human mind, how to protect the structure of a healthy, functional community and society and world, right? Those are very natural concepts to try and think about. So then why is there so much artificial interference with that imposed, right? And the answer is for control. Because if you had a peaceful equilibrium on an economic level, there's no profit margin, right? There's no shekel gribbing, there's no coin clipping there. Because it's like everyone wants to participate. They enjoy and they know that they're getting direct benefit out of participating in a truly free flow of resources, right? And that creates incredible abundance, and it creates a lot of thriving, right? But they don't desire that because they live on the profit margin, right? They live on the friction and pressure income, right? So they want to control the hydraulics of the whole system and make sure that it never flows freely in an equitable manner, because that would create what's known as equilibrium, where everything becomes free. Like energy becomes just free flowing at a manageable, nice level. That's what our bodies are always trying to create. And certain people want to inject nano aerosols into the atmospheric, stratospheric injections, right? They want to do that for some reason. But, you know, we can really bypass that to an extent if we understand the true nature of ourselves and the nature of reality. And by doing so, we know how to benefit ourselves and others, and we know how to avoid harm. So that's a very important thing to learn. And I think it's good to contrast what that would look like in your own mind versus what we have in society, like what's being deliberately created. A million, cosplay, pre-scripted character persona, right? 1 million 1 million casting calls for all these different prefab storylines that put you at the behest of something other than your core or what's really good for you or what's good for society. Like you're in someone else's psychodrama prescription for your destiny, right? Which is not a good place to be, which is why I find it interesting to learn about these different scribal gods. Like Ganesh is a scribal god, Tahuti or Thoth is a scribal god, right? So they have the script of their own life. They're capable to create the script, and it gives a wide variety of skills when you do that. I'm not going to get too much into detail, but I'm just going to say this is a very powerful art. It's closely related to what the Egyptians call Heka, which is often closely equated with the power of speech and how to vibrationally shape and structure reality based on the inner vibration of the heart, right, and the magnetic oscillation of our biofield and so forth like that. This is a powerful signaling intelligence mechanism. It really is. And so we need to start learning about that. Instead of thinking of ourselves like a clay man that's made by God, like some kind of God's golem or something, or Saturnalia's little golem, right? Like we don't necessarily want to be that. We don't want to be a golem. And so even in the Greek times, they also, in the noble lie of Socrates and Plato, he thinks and he says they need to teach people that they're just mannequins, like puppets that are just made by someone else, and they're just machines. Like that's actually what he suggests for his, socialist pedo-utopia. A lot of people don't know that about Pythagoras and these different cult groups is like, that was what they were doing. It was no different than what you have now. That's the same thing L. Ron Hubbard did with the Sea Org, right? Like he just got them all on a boat and he's like, let's go. International waters, what do they call it? Oconus, outside of the continental U.S., where the laws change, right? Yeah, there's a certain type of people that are like, have a multi-millennial like club where that's their gimmick. And they write it into a lot of the storylines. They write that into the meta-narrative in many, many different ways, which I don't feel, based on results right now, is very beneficial for our society. Like when I look around, the result of the meta-narrative that I'm seeing is highly destructive. And it's like even during times of global conflict, like there's very little dissent from that, and there's very little even analysis of it. And this is a problem because, like I said, the transhumanistic meta-narrative is trying to make us go self-obsolete. It's trying to convince us of our own obsolescence so that we surrender the battle. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm doing Spirit War, is I'm trying to get people to conceptualize that, to take action, to formulate their own hyper-altered destiny, right? Like Sun Ra says, the altered destiny. That's where you take the course of action in your life and you take your circumstances and you put it under a modification in order to change your trajectory, in order to become truly free, right, of all imposed external meta-narratives and stories and spins that we're told. Like we go beyond that 100%, and instead of living as the consumer of the script and the consumer of reality, we become the producer of reality. And so the only way to accomplish that is to have total coherence between thought, word, and deed, which is no laughing matter. That's a very difficult task to undertake, but it gives great power to shape one's reality. And this is why there's so much emphasis placed on the vows, taking vows in Buddhism. Like you have to take and sustain your vows. The more vows that you take and sustain, and every time you take a step towards the goals that you set for yourself, you're building this force of commitment, and you're building this force of momentum, like a spiritual momentum, if you will. It's like this power So at that point, the more you commit to that and the more you sustain that over a longer time, as soon as you pronounce something, the probability of its accomplishment is already dramatically enhanced because you follow through. You build a pattern of following through on every single thing you do. And so that builds a powerful type of momentum. And that's kind of what this thing we have called the Samaya, which is like the link between us and our teachers and the gurus or whatever, going all the way back in time. Like we have this thread of connection and continuity to them, which is called the Samaya. And Samaya also is related to the concept of taking an oath and being committed to the oath, not forsaking the oath, right? This is our Samaya. And this is a force that we build through daily action. We're building our own meta-narrative. Like you don't have to necessarily take anyone else's narrative, you know, unless it's helpful to you, right? But the narrative is very important because, like I said, if we're not controlling our own narrative in our own mind, someone else will. And so this is an important thing to conceptualize, and based on that you can formulate strategies, responses, and basically evade and resist tactics. But anyway, this has been Spirit War number 113, the transhuman meta narrative and how to break it.